What if the person you waited for through the coldest winters finally rode back, but carried more than just love in his eyes? The blood-red sun slipped behind the distant Nebraska mountains as Kathleen Morgan stood on her porch, her fingers resting on the weathered railing. The prairie stretched out like an endless brown sea, touched here and there by the first hints of spring green. For most folks, spring meant hope. For her, it meant one thing only. It meant he might finally come home. 3 long winters had passed since she watched Dawson Reed ride away, promising he'd return when he had enough money to build a life with her. 3 winters of waiting, praying, and whispering to the wind that he'd kept his word. The last letter had come 8 months ago. Dawson had written about cattle drives in Texas, money saved, plans nearly complete. Wait for me, Kathleen. When the prairie grass turns green again, I'll be riding home to you. She had folded those words into her heart every day since. Now spring was loosening winter's grip. Each morning she walked out to the porch and scanned the empty horizon, searching for a lone rider. Sometimes she believed she was foolish for hoping. Sometimes she reminded herself that a cowboy's promises weren't always kept. But still, she waited, because her heart gave her no other choice. She had survived her father's passing last fall, kept the small homestead running alone, tended chickens, milked the cow, mended clothes for settlers in Willow Creek, and planted seeds in the cold ground with shaking hands. Somehow, she endured it all while waiting for one man. "You're a fool, Kathleen Morgan," she whispered, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "A cowboy's promises are like morning mist." Yet her eyes still drifted to the horizon. As the first stars blinked awake in the darkening sky, Kathleen sighed and turned toward the door. That was when she heard it. A faint, distant rhythm carried on the cool evening breeze. Hoofbeats. Her heart stumbled. She froze, eyes narrowing toward the south. A rider was approaching the homestead, dust rising behind him. The silhouette grew clearer with each passing second. Broad shoulders. Tall frame. A familiar way of sitting in the saddle, her breath caught. No, it couldn't be. It had been too long. She'd imagined this moment too many times. But the closer he came, the more certain she became. Dawson Reed. Kathleen gripped the porch post as excitement, fear, and 3 years of hope collided inside her. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to call out, unable to breathe. He stopped at the edge of the yard, removed his hat, and for a long moment they simply stared at one another. 3 winters of separation hung heavy in the air. "Kathleen!" he finally called, his voice deeper, worn by miles and hardship. She swallowed hard. "You're late, Dawson Reed." A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "I know. I'm hoping you'll forgive me." Everything in her wanted to run to him, but pride held her frozen. "That depends," she said, fighting the tremble in her voice. "What have you brought me that's worth 3 winters of waiting?" Dawson swung off his horse in one smooth motion. He reached into his saddlebag and crossed the yard with steady steps. In the fading light, she saw the changes in him. Leaner, broader. A scar ran across his left cheek. His temples now carried faint flecks of gray. When he stopped at the foot of the porch steps, he lifted his hand. He opened his fingers. A simple gold ring lay in his palm, its tiny diamond catching the last light of day. "I promised I'd come back when I had something to offer you," he said in a low voice. "Something real. Something more than dreams." Tears stung Kathleen's eyes. She slowly descended the steps, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "You fool," she whispered. "Did you really think I needed a ring to wait for you?" Dawson's eyes softened. "I needed to give you one. So you'd know I came back, the man you deserve." Her fingers shook as she reached for the ring, but before she could touch it, a question rose in her chest and escaped her lips. "Where were you all this time, Dawson? What took you so long?" He let out a long breath. "Texas mostly. Drove cattle north, tried mining in Colorado. Got into trouble, got out, saved money, lost it, saved more." His jaw tightened. "Every day I thought of you, every single day." "And the letters?" she asked softly. Pain flickered across his face. I got bushwhacked near Dodge City, took a bullet, lost my horse, my money, everything, nearly lost my life. It took months to get back on my feet, to earn enough to finish the journey home." His voice lowered. "I thought maybe you'd given up." Kathleen shook her head as a tear slipped down her cheek. "I made a promise too." His hand trembled as he held the ring between them. "Then make another one," he said. "Marry me, Kathleen. I know I don't deserve it after making you wait so long, but—" She didn't let him finish. Her hand closed over his, and then she was in his arms, holding him tighter than she had held anything in years. "Yes," she whispered into his chest. "The answer has always been yes." Dawson lifted her face and kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that erased 3 years of pain, fear, and silence. A kiss that tasted like home. Inside the small cabin, lamplight glowed warm across the table and the walls. Dawson watched her move about preparing a simple meal, his expression softening with every step she took. She had grown stronger in his absence, her eyes wiser, her hands steadier. "Your father?" he asked quietly. Her movements slowed. Pneumonia took him last November. Dawson reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." "You're here now," she whispered. He reached into his vest and unfolded a paper. "I bought land," he said, laying the deed on the table. 500 acres west of here. Good grazing land. And a small herd is being driven up from Texas. We'll start our ranch together." Kathleen looked at him, hardly able to breathe. "A home, a future, a life. When can I see it?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said with a smile. "I'll show you everything." For the first time in years, hope filled the room like sunlight. A new beginning had come to the prairie. A beginning she had waited for through winter after winter. The next morning broke clear and bright as Kathleen stepped out into the cool spring air. Birds called from the cottonwoods, and the prairie spread out before her in soft waves of new green. Dawson was already outside tending to his horse, the sunlight catching in his dark hair as he worked. For a moment she simply watched him, still half afraid he might vanish like one of her winter dreams. When he spotted her, he smiled with a warmth that reached his eyes. "Ready to see our future?" Kathleen nodded, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She saddled her father's old mare while Dawson tightened the cinch on his gelding. Soon they were riding west across the prairie, side by side like the years apart had never happened. As the land stretched wide around them, Dawson pointed out distant ridges and creek bends. "We'll put the main house up there," he said, gesturing toward a rise that overlooked a fork in the creek. "It'll catch the morning sun and stay warm in winter." Kathleen studied the land with careful eyes. "The soil looks good by that slope for a garden, and plenty of grass for grazing." Dawson glanced at her with quiet pride. "I knew you'd see it the same way I did." By midday, they reached the small cabin on his newly bought property. It was nothing more than a one-room shelter with rough-hewn walls, a stone fireplace, and a dirt floor. But it was sturdy, and when Dawson opened the door, sunlight spilled across the simple table and bunk inside. "It isn't much," he said gently, watching her reaction. "But it's a start." Kathleen stepped inside, running her hand over the rough wood. "It's more than Papa and I had when we first came west, and it's ours, Dawson." "That makes it perfect." Relief washed over him. He moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, breathing her in. "We'll build something better before winter. I promise." She leaned back against him, trusting that promise the way she had trusted all of his words from the moment she met him. They spent the afternoon exploring the land. Dawson showed her the spring-fed pond, the natural meadow he planned for hay, and the sheltered draw where a barn could be built. As they walked, Kathleen saw more than fields and timber. She saw the life they would carve out together, the life she'd waited 3 winters for. Later, they sat beneath a tall cottonwood tree to share the lunch she had packed. A soft breeze moved through the new leaves overhead. "I kept every letter you sent," she said, plucking at a blade of grass. "Read them so many times I nearly tore the paper." Dawson studied her profile, his expression softening. "I wish I could have written more. Sometimes it was impossible. But I never stopped thinking about you." She hesitated before asking the question that had quietly haunted her. "Dawson, in all that time, was there ever someone else?" Quote, His surprise was plain, but so was the honesty in his voice. "No, I had chances, but none of those women were you. You were the only one." Kathleen's shoulders relaxed as she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "A settler named Daniel Forrester asked to court me last summer." She admitted softly, "I told him my heart already belonged to a man who promised to return." A flare of jealousy flickered in Dawson's eyes, but it faded quickly into something deeper, gratitude. "You waited for me," he murmured. "I did," she said. "I always knew you'd come home." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," she teased gently. "But you're stuck with me now." They rode back to her homestead that evening, the prairie glowing gold under the setting sun. For the first time in years, Kathleen felt the weight of winter lifting from her heart. The days that followed were filled with bustle and excitement. Word of Dawson's return spread quickly through Willow Creek. Neighbors she'd helped during hard times arrived at her doorstep with gifts, food, and warm congratulations. On Saturday, Kathleen stood in her bedroom holding her mother's old wedding dress. The ivory silk had yellowed with age, but it remained beautiful. Her eyes stung as she imagined wearing it down the aisle toward the man she had waited for through every season. A knock sounded. "Kathleen?" Dawson called from outside. "Mrs. Peterson is here." Elena Peterson swept into the room with all the energy of a woman determined to fix the world with her own two hands. She inspected the dress, clucked her tongue, and began smoothing folds with practiced ease. "It needs a pressing, but it'll do wonderfully," she declared. Then she opened her basket and produced a delicate lace veil. "This is something borrowed, dear. I wore it at my wedding." It's time it saw joy again. Kathleen blinked back tears as she accepted the treasured gift. Elena's expression softened. "Dawson looks like he's lived a hard life these past years," she said quietly. "But he looked at you like a man who knows he's found home." "He has," Kathleen whispered. That night, Dawson found her in the barn quietly brushing her mare. He stepped close, his hands gentle as he took the brush from her. "Nervous?" he asked softly. "Only a little," she said. "Are you?" Quote. He laughed under his breath. "Terrified." Then he stroked her cheek. "But more grateful than anything. You waited for me, Kathleen. You held on to us even when I wasn't here." She stepped into his arms. We waited for each other. The next morning, sunlight poured across the Nebraska prairie as church bells rang over Willow Creek. Dawson Reed stood at the front of the small church, freshly shaved, and wearing a clean suit that fit him awkwardly, like a man unused to such formality. But when Kathleen appeared in her mother's wedding dress, her auburn hair shining beneath Elena's lace veil, Dawson's breath left him. She walked toward him with steady steps, her eyes shimmering with emotion. When her hand slipped into his, everything else faded away. As the preacher spoke, Dawson looked at her the way a man does when he realizes all the winters of his life have led him to one single spring. And when he slid the gold ring onto her finger, his hand shook. "You came back," she whispered. "I always would," he murmured. "Always." Quote. They sealed it with a kiss that made the entire congregation erupt with cheers. They were finally husband and wife. The celebration in Willow Creek echoed long after the music stopped. By the time Kathleen and Dawson returned to her small homestead, the moon hung high above the prairie. Their shadows stretched across the yard, soft and long, as Dawson lifted his bride across the threshold, like he dreamed of doing for 3 long years. Inside, someone had left fresh flowers on the table and lit a small lamp that cast a warm glow over the room. Kathleen stood still for a moment, taking in the quiet, the safety, the new beginning wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Dawson stepped behind her, his hands slipping around her waist. "We're really married," he whispered into her hair. She smiled, leaning back against him. 3 winters felt like a lifetime, but now you're here. "And I'm never leaving again," he promised, kissing the top of her head. That night, their small cabin became a haven of whispered promises, soft laughter, and a deep love that had survived distance, silence, and uncertainty. The world outside faded away. All that remained was them. The next morning, sunlight streamed in through the window and found Dawson cooking breakfast, while Kathleen tried not to laugh at how seriously he took the task. "I swear you're burning those eggs," she teased. "I'm a married man now," he declared. "I have responsibilities." She nudged him with her hip. "Then your first responsibility is to let me cook before you set this cabin on fire." He grinned, kissed her forehead, and stepped aside. After breakfast, they packed her belongings: clothes, quilts, tools, her mother's small cedar box, and loaded them onto a wagon borrowed from the Petersons. With her mare tied behind, and Dawson riding alongside, they headed west toward their new land. When the cabin came into view, Kathleen felt her breath catch. She had seen it before, but seeing it again now, knowing it would soon be their home, made something warm settle in her chest. Over the next days, life fell into a steady rhythm. Dawson worked on the corral and barn. Kathleen cleaned the cabin, planted her garden, and organized the small space to make it livable. Neighbors stopped by, offering help, meals, and smiles. Willow Creek had watched her struggle for years. Now they watched her beginning a new life. At night, Dawson read aloud from books Tom Blackwood had brought. Kathleen sewed curtains and mended Dawson's shirts while curled up beside him. Sometimes they simply held hands and listened to the wind outside the door. One evening, while they sat on the porch watching the stars appear, Dawson took her hand and placed it on his chest. "This place," he said softly, "feels like the first real home I've had since my parents passed." Kathleen leaned into him. "Then we'll make it a place where joy lives." He kissed her hair. "With you here, it already is." As spring strengthened into early summer, the herd Dawson had purchased finally arrived. 4 cowboys drove the cattle across the prairie toward the new corral. Dust rose in thick clouds, and the longhorns thundered across the grass, their hooves shaking the earth. Dawson stood beside Kathleen, pride shining in his eyes. "That's the start of our ranch, the first real piece of our future." Kathleen squeezed his hand. "It's beautiful." That night the cowboys stayed for supper. The small cabin filled with laughter, stories, and the smell of hot stew. One cowboy, a grizzled man named Tom, studied Kathleen with a knowing smile. "You waited for him," Tom said gently. "That's a rare thing." Kathleen looked toward Dawson, who was laughing with the others near the fire. The lamplight softened his features, making him look younger, lighter. "I always knew he'd come back," she said. "And he always talked about you," Tom replied. Even when he was near dying, he'd say, "I gotta make it home. Kathleen's waiting." Quote. Kathleen's eyes warmed. He came home. That's all that matters. By midsummer, the ranch had grown into a lively place. The barn was sturdy. The cattle grazed in green pastures. The cabin smelled of fresh bread, soap, and Dawson's leather coat, always hung by the door. One warm evening, the sky streaked with orange and pink, Dawson took Kathleen's hand and guided her to the cottonwood tree that overlooked the creek. He pointed toward the house foundation rising beside the cabin. "By fall, that will be your new kitchen window. You'll be able to watch the sunrise every morning. And you'll be able to watch me chase you out of the house when you try to fix everything yourself," she teased. He laughed and pulled her close. As the wind rustled the cottonwood leaves, Kathleen looked across the land, the place she had imagined in her dreams, and felt something shift inside her, a soft flutter, a new kind of warmth. Days later, she realized what it meant. Months passed. Autumn came. And one night, while Dawson worked by lamplight carving a cradle from oak, Kathleen walked to him with trembling hands. "Dawson," she said softly, placing his hand on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." His eyes lifted to hers, widening with wonder, hope, and overwhelming joy. "Kathleen, are you sure?" Quote. She nodded through tears. "Yes, our baby will be born in late spring." He gathered her into his arms with a trembling breath. "God above, I don't deserve this much happiness." "You do," she whispered. "We both do." Spring returned with blossoms and new grass. And one bright morning, as sunlight poured through the window, Kathleen brought a baby girl into the world. Dawson held her close, tears slipping down his cheeks. "She has your eyes." he whispered, "and your strength." Kathleen smiled weakly. "What should we name her?" He kissed their daughter's forehead. "Sarah, after my mother." "Sarah Reed," Kathleen whispered. "Welcome home." Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass, the same grass Kathleen had waited beside through winter after winter. Now, spring had finally brought everything she dreamed of. A husband who kept his promise, a ring that symbolized forever, a family beginning, and a life built with love on the wide Nebraska prairie.